So what attitudes do we care about? Now, when we're talking about job attitudes, these are usually positive and negative evaluations about aspects of your work or your organization. So these are just evaluations that you have about your work. Now, which of these are most commonly studied? These are job satisfaction, organizational commitment, POS, perceived organizational support, and engagement. A really important note, and I'm going to emphasize this in all caps, next slide. I will not go over everything that's in the book. The chapter is extremely long. It has a lot of information about very specific studies, very specific, outcomes of job satisfaction, outcomes of organizational commitment that are not worth your time or my time for us to go over again. I recommend reading the textbook, but I'm not going to reiterate everything here. Like I said, there are very valuable illustrations there. But I'm just not going to go over it. And compared to other modules where there was a huge overlap between the textbook and the lecture, I'm just not going to reiterate everything. And I will summarize. I more than likely will not expect you to know the specific studies or the specific things that were found unless I mention them here in the lecture. Okay, so going to the book is more for your edification, but I'm not going to cover everything that's in the book. There are also a lot of factors that influence each attitude that we will talk about. There are also a lot of outcomes that each attitude can predict that I will talk about. So I will usually give a couple of illustrations of influences and outcomes, but I will not go over, as I said, every single one talked in the book. That just wouldn't be a good use of your time or a good use of my time right now. Nor would I really expect you to remember or know every example in the textbook. So let's talk about job satisfaction. Job satisfaction is probably the best or most well-studied attitude in IO psychology and organizational behavior. So job satisfaction is an evaluative state that expresses contentment with and positive feelings about one's job. It has two components, an affective component and a cognitive component. So it has an emotional component, your feelings about your job, and then a cognitive component, your thoughts and beliefs about your job. Now here's a model of how job satisfaction, impacts different things and what impacts job satisfaction. So characteristics of the job as well as characteristics of the individual can influence job satisfaction. Once again, social factors, so social experiences that you have in the workplace can influence your job satisfaction. And then growth opportunities. So opportunities for growth in an organization can influence your satisfaction. And of course, much like what we would expect, your job satisfaction, your attitude will impact different behaviors in the workplace. So it will impact your performance, so how much you do your job. It will impact whether you leave, whether you partake in your job, whether you're absent, and that's what we're talking about when we see this concept right here, withdrawal. And then counterproductive behaviors. It will also influence the extent to which you waste time, you engage in theft, and other problematic behaviors in the workplace. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about this first aspect of the model here, the job characteristics that can lead to more job satisfaction. We've already been through this before, so I won't necessarily belabor the point because we already know what job characteristics lead to job satisfaction because we just talked about it in the motivation module. Jobs that have a greater task identity, skill variety, autonomy, and task significance are those that are more likely to lead to job satisfaction. Remember, these are those things that influence those intermediate psychological states that led to outcomes like, yes, intrinsic motivation, but also job satisfaction. So if you're wondering what these are, go ahead and take a look back at our motivation section because I go over what these are in a little bit more detail. So there are some individual differences that can predict job satisfaction as well. And this is actually a really interesting idea because what that means is that there could be stable traits that we can actually measure our employees on that would allow us to predict, yes, things like job performance and task performance, but also would influence or things that would also allow us to predict how satisfied they are with their job. And given that satisfaction has downstream effects on things like performance, it may actually be beneficial to try to consider some of those things if you have the ability to do so. Now, And if, of course, it's legal, that's where it would potentially get murky, is the legality of predicting something that, or assessing something that predicts job satisfaction because it predicts job performance. That would be some legal murky area. But what individual differences can actually impact your job satisfaction? Well, let's take a little step back. Research has shown, and that I should actually change this right here to job satisfaction. So I hope I can write little, give me just 1 second, and we can get rid of that performance, and it should say, just put sat for satisfaction. Job satisfaction is generally stable. So what that means is that research has continued to show us that when people work in different jobs, their job satisfaction generally tends to be the same or roughly at a same level. So if you're the kind of person who is generally satisfied with their work in one job, you probably are going to be satisfied with your work in another. And it's the same for people who are dissatisfied. And many of you may say, oh yes, this resonates with me because I know someone, or I work with someone who, no matter what job they have, no matter what kind of work they do, they're always unhappy. And indeed, research has even shown, when we looked at the Minnesota twin study. So the Minnesota twin study, for the record, is a study that you may have talked about in your intro psych class, but it's a study that looked at twins who were separated at birth, identical twins and even fraternal twins who were separated at birth. And it looked at the similarities between twins who are separated at birth. The idea being that identical twins who are separated at birth are raised in different environments. So any similarities that we see between them are due to their shared genetics. And with identical twins, they have effectively the same DNA. So with an identical twin, or with a set of identical twins, looking at what they share in common and what they are different in regard, because they were reared in different environments. So they were raised by different parents, raised by completely different families. What we would find then, if things were similar between the twins, then maybe we could conclude that it's based on their genetics and not the shared environment that siblings who are raised together have. So what we find is that twins raised separately, so identical twins raised by different families or different family units, had similar levels of job satisfaction. So that suggests that there is potentially some genetic underpinning or basis for your job satisfaction. Now, why might this be? Some researchers have successfully argued and demonstrated that it might be due to trait affect or your affective disposition. What these two terms get at is your tendency to feel and experience certain emotions. And I believe I talked about this previously in this class. But remember that certain individuals have tendencies to experience positive and or negative emotions. You have some people who just generally are better about, or rather, you have some people who generally feel positive emotions, and you have some people who generally feel negative emotions across different situations. This gets into this concept of trait affect or affective disposition. So what this tells us then is that when we are hiring people to come and work in our organizations, what we might find is that the employees who work with us or work for us bring in these tendencies to experience certain emotions. So you may hire someone who is low on trait affect or has negative trait affect, so they tend to experience negative emotions. You might hire someone on that and then find that they are dissatisfied with their job, and that impacts their performance. And you might wonder, well, what can I do as an employer to change it? But you would also have to acknowledge that maybe you hired someone who's just not going to like doing their job no matter what, because what happens is the person who has those negative emotions, they misattribute the negative emotions to the work. So instead of realizing, I'm just the kind of person who experiences negative emotions and it has nothing to do with my job, the person says, I'm experiencing my negative emotions because of my work, for example, in this scenario. So that is why people who tend to have low negative affect, trait negative affect. They tend to, or rather they are high in negative affect. So they tend to experience negative emotions. That is why they may experience more job dissatisfaction regardless of what's going on in their job. The same, for the record, can also be said of people who tend to experience positive emotions, or these people who have high trait positive affect. So they tend to experience, regardless of the situation, positive emotions. These people are far more likely to experience job satisfaction, regardless of the scenario or the job they're working in, because much like the people who had negative emotions attributed it to their jobs, the people who have positive emotions are going to conclude, well, I feel positively and feel positive emotions when I'm at work. I must therefore be satisfied with my job or like my job. So there are also social factors that can influence the extent to which we experience job satisfaction. These include things like organizational justice. So the more fairly you are treated by other people in the organization, the more likely it is that the more fairly people are treated, the more likely it is that they will experience high levels of job satisfaction. And there are a number of theories that we can offer to explain this. The simplest is that being treated fairly makes us feel positive emotions. And when we feel positive emotions in the workplace, it translates into job satisfaction. So there are some factors that also can influence our job satisfaction. The the textbook notes that people have different growth factors that can influence how much they are satisfied, and it discusses pay under these growth factors. Now, money actually only modestly impacts job satisfaction, which is somewhat contrary to what the character of Stanley on The Office illustrates for us. For those of you who may not be aware, Stanley consistently is saying, how about you pay me more, we do our jobs better. He's always saying all he wants is more pay. And it seems that he's implying he would be much happier with his job and his life and his work if he was paid more. But once again, what research shows is that it really only modestly impacts your satisfaction. And that's because, yes, money is very important. Being able to put food on the table is very important. As we talked in our motivation section, you do need to satisfy people's basic needs. But there's so much more beyond basic need satisfaction that can make an employee happy and make an employee satisfied with their job. The other thing to note is that paying people more, they become accustomed to it, right? It's the new normal for them. So if you bump up someone's salary, they may show some increases in satisfaction temporarily, but they go away because the person then gets accustomed to that level of salary, and then they start to become dissatisfied with it. So paying your employees appropriately is always a good idea because you want to keep good talent. But if you think that if you just keep paying your employees more and more, they'll be more satisfied and therefore more productive, you'll actually find some limits to that effect. So be judicious in deciding how much you want to pay people to increase their satisfaction and therefore their performance. So let's imagine then that you are in an organization where you want to measure job satisfaction, or you're a consultant, an IO consultant or an HR consultant, and you are asked to do an employee climate survey in the sense of asking employees, how do they feel working for that organization? There are a number of ways that we can measure job satisfaction, and the book outlines a ton of them. I'm only doing a few here because we don't need to go over everything that's in the textbook. So one approach is a global approach. This asks about people's general perceptions of their satisfaction. And it includes questions like, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your job? So it gets at a very general perception of how satisfied an employee is. One pro to that is that it's time saving and it seems to get at what we need. I don't need to get into the nitty gritty of what's leading people to be dissatisfied. All I need to know is, are you satisfied or are you not? The downside, though, is that if we find that our employees are dissatisfied, that a general or global measure of job satisfaction doesn't give us enough details to then pinpoint what is driving that dissatisfaction. So if you have an employee survey that comes back and you see, oh, people are really satisfied, you may say, job's done, don't need to do any more. But if you have one come back that says people are really dissatisfied, but we have no idea why because we just use this general measure, then you may find yourself running into some problems or difficulties then deciding what are you going to do if you have no idea why people are dissatisfied. So that's why we might draw on facet-based approaches to studying job satisfaction, or rather measuring it. So here you ask about specific aspects of the work and people's satisfaction with it. So you can ask about, are you just happy with the work that you do? Are you happy with your pay? Are you happy with promotion opportunities? Those sorts of things. The great thing about this is it can isolate specific problems, but as the textbook illustrates, these are extremely lengthy surveys. And so employees can become fatigued. It can take them a really long time, and therefore it might not be and therefore it's more costly. So therefore might not be as ideal to do a very lengthy measure like what's listed here, the job descriptive index. The job descriptive index, like I allude to, is a facet-based approach. It asks you questions about your work, your supervisor, your coworker, and work here meaning the actual job you do, your supervisor, your coworkers, your pay, and your promotion. Like I said, the pros here are that we can pinpoint specific issues that are driving down employee satisfaction. The downside is that it's expensive. So upside, we can be specific and identify specific problems. Downside, it's usually very time intensive and costly. Most of these, the two approaches, the global approach that I talked about previously, as well as the facet-based approach, though, are known as cognitive approaches, or a cognitive perspective on job satisfaction. So if you recall a few slides before, job satisfaction consists of both a cognitive, so a thoughts or belief-based understanding of, or a thoughts or belief-based perception of job satisfaction, as well as an affective component. So those emotions that influence your job satisfaction. We can, though, measure this affective component by asking employees to respond to a scale about their work or how they feel working using a scale that you see here. You know, one of these ones where you see faces, for example. Tell me how you feel while you're working with your job, or which of these best characterizes your satisfaction with your work. And so you ask them to select one of these faces depending on which best actually represents their emotional state working for their job. So that's the affective approach. The emotional approach gets at the emotional component to job satisfaction. Okay, so as also alluded to previously, the reason we are so interested in studying job satisfaction is that it presumably has an impact on job performance. The more satisfied you are with your work, the likelier it is that you will perform it well. Now, the impact of job satisfaction research has shown is the impact of job satisfaction on job performance, research has shown, is generally modest. It's about 0.30. So that's a modest effect. It's not super strong, it's not super weak, it's just kind of in the middle. But there are situations in which job satisfaction has a stronger impact on task performance. For example, we find that under complex jobs, more complex jobs, job satisfaction is far more likely to influence performance than under low complexity jobs. We also find that culture, so national culture, can influence the impact of satisfaction on performance, such that in cultures where independence is prioritized over collectivism, individualism is prioritized over collectivism, we find that the relationship is much stronger between job satisfaction and job performance. So those are some of the ways in which satisfaction impacts performance. It's one of the outcomes we would be interested in, and ultimately why we care about, theoretically, why we care about job satisfaction. Counterproductive behaviors are also impacted by job satisfaction. No surprise, the more dissatisfied your employees are, the more counterproductive behaviors they engage in. And this should be a concern for people. There might be some individuals who think I shouldn't care whether my employees are happy or satisfied. And you would be well within your rights to tell them, well, you're going to have employees who are wasting company time. You're going to have employees who are stealing things. You're going to have employees who are assaulting each other if you have dissatisfied employees. So satisfaction, you can argue, is in and of itself important, but it does have an impact on other things that are more instrumentally important, like task performance and counterproductive behaviors. A little bit of a divergence, because I do want to talk about how satisfaction can impact other other behaviors like withdrawal that I don't think we've given enough attention to in previous modules. And this is really fascinating too, because I think it's important to understand that you can't take your employees' satisfaction for granted. And you also can't take the fact that your employees aren't leaving as an indicator that they are happy and satisfied working for your organization. So let's talk about a couple of these related issues to job satisfaction. So let's talk first about absenteeism. Absenteeism is when people are absent at work when they should be. So this is different than taking vacation time, taking appropriate sick time, calling out sick, following the rules. These are people who just don't show and don't account for it. So what we find is that job satisfaction does impact the extent to which employees attend their work. But it's not just as simple as the more satisfied you are, the more likely you are to attend. First, you have to have the motivation to attend. We've talked about this in the past, that you have to have a motive to actually perform a certain behavior. So job satisfaction leads to a greater motivation to attend. And this relationship is even stronger when there are high pressures in your organization, social pressures, to attend to your work. So if you work in an organization where there's a strong norm of showing up and doing your job and not missing a day of work unless you have called out specifically on sick or vacation time, then we will see a stronger relationship between your satisfaction and your motive to attend. However, if there's a strong cultural norm of people just not showing up for their work and presumably no one getting punished for it, then we might actually see that that relationship is decreased, or that it's closer to zero, that your satisfaction won't impact your attendance as much if either there isn't a pressure to attend, or in fact there's a normative culture in which attendance is not expected and you see many people just not showing up to work. And this makes sense, right? Think instead of job satisfaction of your class satisfaction, your satisfaction with classes that you've had either online or in person. The extent to which you see other students not coming in to, not, tuning in virtually or in person to a class, the more likely it is that you are not going to have a motive to attend, regardless of how much you individually actually like that class. We've all certainly been there in a class that maybe you enjoyed, but when you start to see that other people aren't attending it, you think, maybe I shouldn't attend it, or I don't really want to attend it anymore because I don't see other people doing it. So why should I? So your attendance motivation can decrease sometimes, or rather not be as impacted by your job satisfaction when there are different pressures to attend. Of course, if there's a strong pressure to attend, the impact of your satisfaction on your attendance motivation going to be much higher. The flip side of that, let's take a class that you do see people are always there, they're always attending, and there's this strong norm and culture of attending that class. Well, the more satisfied you are with the class, the effect on your attendance motivation will be even stronger under those conditions of high social pressures to attend. But it's not just about having a motive. Of course, attendance motivation does lead to more attendance. If an employee is motivated to come to work, they are more likely to come to work. But we have to acknowledge that there are other factors that can influence how much your motivation translates into your behavior. So many of you have experienced this with work or with school, where no matter how much your motive is to attend, if you have personal factors that limit the extent to which you can actually show up, then you won't be able to show up, right? If your car breaks down, if your bus route is inconsistent. I know I've certainly been there when you can't rely on a bus route to get you to class or to work on time or with great consistency. So sometimes the ability to attend is impacted by other factors. So we as supervisors and employers need to understand that if employees aren't attending, yes, it can be a reflection of their satisfaction, but it can also be influenced by the factors that can limit their ability to attend, that they have no control over, as well as the extent to which there are social pressures influencing them to attend or to not attend. So that's the conclusion we should take here in a nutshell, is that job satisfaction, though it can eventually lead to greater attendance, it is always going to be that relationship is always going to be impacted by other things like social pressure and the ability to be present at work. Presenteeism is somewhat the flip side of absenteeism, in the sense that, absenteeism is people not coming to work when they should be at work. Presenteeism is people coming into work when they shouldn't be. This is a huge issue under COVID right now, where people will come into work even though they are sick, even if they have COVID tests out, even if they know potentially that they are COVID positive. There are people who will still come into work. And we shouldn't assume, though, that people who come into work are necessarily doing it because they are careless or thoughtless. Sometimes there's a huge compulsion for people to attend work because, they need a paycheck. If you're paid by the hour and you don't show up for those hours, you don't get paid. So people often come in when they shouldn't. And this is a big COVID problem. And I will say here that the impact of satisfaction on presenteeism is somewhat complicated, right? Because presumably people who are satisfied with their jobs and maybe super motivated to be present because they're super committed to their organization may say, well, if I don't show up, even if I'm sick, then my organization is going to suffer. So it can be complicated in that way, where something like satisfaction could lead to this undesirable behavior. So it's just something to be aware of. And rather here, my point is not necessarily to illuminate how much job satisfaction impacts us, but rather to make you aware that presenteeism is also something that we should be concerned about when it comes to our employees and what they're doing in the workplace. Recall, we've also talked about turnover. So I think we talked about some of these different turnover profiles a while ago, but just to remind you, when people leave an organization, which is what turnover is, they have sometimes different reasons for doing so, and therefore different emotional states when they are leaving the organization. So we can have people who are reluctant and people who are enthusiastic. People who are reluctant are people who are leaving and they don't really want to. And then there are people who are enthusiastic, and these are people who are leaving who really want to. And those are, for the record, are reluctant leavers and enthusiastic leavers. So a reluctant leaver is someone who is not happy about leaving or quitting an organization. An enthusiastic leaver is one where the person is excited and is happy about leaving the organization. We also have reluctant stayers. These are people who stay at organizations even though they are dissatisfied and would rather leave. And then we have enthusiastic stayers. These are people who stay employed at an organization because they genuinely like working there. The reason we highlight these different turnover profiles is because when you are at an organization, you should never assume that your turnover data means what you think it means about job satisfaction. So, for example, you may say, oh, we have very low rates of turnover, so people must be satisfied with their work there. However, under certain economic conditions, take now for instance, you may find that people are staying at organizations even if they're very unhappy because they really feel like they have nowhere else to go, that if they lose their job, it could be months before they find another. So those would be reluctant stayers. Of course, in a time that we aren't dealing with a pandemic-induced economic recession, we may find that if people are staying at our organizations, they may be more likely to be enthusiastic stayers. Because when you have a lot of opportunities available to your employees, but they are staying at your organization, it may be more reasonable to conclude that they must be staying because they are happy working there. What's also important to note, though, is if you have high rates of turnover, that you need to be sure to be aware of whether it's being driven by factors that are internal to your organization or external to your organization. So, for example, I used to live in San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio, Texas is, surprisingly to a lot of people, a huge military town. We have multiple military installations in San Antonio. And so in a place like San Antonio, you may actually get a lot of turnover due more to military spouses and military families being restationed elsewhere. So in a place like San Antonio, you may have high rates of turnover, but it has nothing to do with your organization and everything to do about the local environment in which you have a lot of people coming into town and leaving town because of their military assignments. So in that case, an organization that has high rates of turnover that exists in San Antonio may have to do a deeper dive and try to understand how many of the people leaving our organization are happy to do so, or how many of them maybe fall into this group of military significant others or family members who are moving because they have to, because the government is telling them to. So The point here is that turnover is a useful data point to understand how satisfaction is impacting our employees and their choices to stay or leave our organization. But we should never assume that because someone is staying at an organization that they are satisfied, and we should never assume that someone who is leaving an organization is dissatisfied. What's really interesting about turnover is it happens in an unfolding model, and job satisfaction is where it starts, or rather, job dissatisfaction. So here we can see that from job satisfaction, all of these arrows come. And so usually, like I said, we're thinking about job dissatisfaction. So when people are dissatisfied with their job, they begin to have thoughts of quitting. So they start to think about quitting more, and their attitude toward quitting changes. So they become more pro quitting. What this also does is it leads to some other behaviors and thoughts that actually lead them to engage in turnover. So the attitude toward quitting might lead you to engage in a job search. So you start to think, I'm a little bit more open to quitting these days. Let me start looking at what jobs are available in my area. And you start to then think about these alternative jobs you could have, and you either engage in a direct or implicit comparison. So maybe you don't apply for the jobs, but you see how much your job just doesn't stack up, or you start to think, maybe working there would be so much better for me. So then you start to compare alternatives. This can also happen if you get an offer. If you apply for a job and you get an offer, then you start to compare where you're working now versus where you could work. And this will lead you to either quit or stay. Remember, we talked about some people who stay even though they don't want to. We could presumably have people who quit because they also don't want to. But here we're assuming that if someone has thoughts of quitting and they are looking at presumably more desirable alternatives, that they are more likely to quit or to want to quit. We'll talk about that, I think, a little bit later, but that gets at turnover intentions. So sometimes we can't directly study turnover. It's very complicated, but sometimes we can't. So we study turnover intentions, people's plans or desires to quit. And that's also an important thing to look at, because you probably want to know, even if people are staying in your organization, are they doing this? Are they thinking of quitting? Do they want to quit, but they're staying? Because that means that those employees, they're probably not actually going to perform very well because they're so anxious to leave your organization. Of course, the opposite happens, where people who are satisfied with their job, they're unlikely to have thoughts of quitting. They're probably not going to have a positive attitude towards quitting. They're probably not going to search for other jobs. They're happy. Why waste time? Why bother? If I'm happy with my job, why look at other jobs? They're therefore also unlikely to engage in this comparison of alternatives where they would see, maybe I could get a better salary or be happier working somewhere else. And therefore, they're more likely to stay. What's really interesting, for the record, is that this model, a very similar model, exists in the romantic relationships literature and the social psychology domain, where a very similar process unfolds when you are in a romantic relationship, which I just find very fascinating, that the process that goes on with an organization is very similar to what happens in romantic relationships when it comes to dissatisfaction and ending the relationship. Okay, so that's the end of the part on job satisfaction. So let's go ahead and talk about organizational commitment. So commitment is an individual's psychological bond with the organization, as represented by an affective attachment to the organization, internalization of its values and goals, and a behavioral desire to put forth effort and support it. Your book notes that job satisfaction can be a little bit more variable, so it can change more frequently, from day to day, week to week. Organizational commitment is a little bit more stable, and that's because organizational commitment is your bond with the organization, the extent to which you feel connected and committed to working for that organization. That's going to be pretty stable because your organization won't often change. However, your job, the nature of your job, the work that you do, that can sometimes change day to day and week to week, if not, then month to month. So that's why organizational commitment is a little bit more stable than job satisfaction. There are generally 3 types of organizational commitment that are studied. These are affective, normative, and continuance commitment. Affective commitment is actually the one that is studied the most. I won't get into it why, because I'm not sure it's necessarily important for you all to know, but it's the one that's studied the most. What it characterizes is the extent to which you feel valued by your organization and you are emotionally attached to your organization. It also reflects how much you see your personal goals as similar to the goals of your organization. Research generally shows that affective commitment is the one that has the strongest impact on the outcomes we would be interested in, things like performance, for example. And I think we'll revisit that in a little bit about affective commitment. Now, normative and continuance commitment, on the other hand, aren't really studied as much. And part of this is because researchers have argued that they aren't actually all that different from certain concepts like turnover intentions. So that's one of the reasons we don't actually study them too much. But normative commitment, to give you an idea of what it is, refers to your moral obligation and your loyalty to remain in your organization. So the extent to which you feel like you're obligated to continue working for your organization. Continuance commitment, on the other hand, is your perception of the sacrifice and sunk costs that you would lose if you leave your organization, in a nutshell. Like I said, a lot of those elements are similar to what we study in turnover. So sometimes people don't study these two things because they're so akin to what we study when we look at turnover. So here are some items that we would see on measures of each type of commitment. So we have affective commitment. I do not feel a strong sense of belonging to my organization. This would be reverse coded. So this is the opposite of what we would expect. So another way to phrase this that shows affective commitment is I feel a strong sense of belonging to my organization. Normative commitment, one way we would ask people about this is to ask them to rate their agreement with this organization deserves my loyalty. Then continuance commitment, I feel I have too few options to consider leaving this organization. So that gives you some idea of what we are asking people about when we ask them about affective, normative, and continuance commitment. So here's a model of how organizational commitment is influenced in an organization, as well as what it influences in an organization, similar to what I showed you with job satisfaction. So we once again have organizational mechanisms, individual characteristics, and social factors that impact commitment, which therefore impacts performance, withdrawal, and counterproductive behaviors. So reward systems are one of the social factors that can, or organizational factors that can influence your commitment. How you reward people can lead to more commitment. So we've talked about this in the past, linking rewards to performance. The extent to which you reward people and reward them in a meaningful way can lead them to be more committed. In terms of individual differences, your book goes into this a lot. I really don't think that it's something that you need to worry too much about, but commitment profiles refers to this individual difference where we may have actually different profiles of commitment. Some of us may be high on affective commitment only and low on the other types of commitment. Some of us may be high on all forms of commitment. So in that way, our different profiles can influence our behaviors in the workplace. The reason for the record we look at profiles is sometimes the impact of something like affective commitment needs to be understood in the context of other types of commitment. So someone who is high on affective commitment only and low on continuance and normative commitment may act and behave differently in an organization than someone who is high in affective, continuance, and normative commitment. We will revisit this, I think, when we talk about groups and teams and we look at conflict profiles in teams. So here we would say, yes, it's important to study affective commitment on its own, but it's also important to understand that the impact of affective commitment will be contextualized or influenced by the other types of commitment that people can have. So when we find that if there's any profile that has high level of affective commitment, there's always going to be low turnover. So that's one thing this research has shown. We've also found that when there's dominant affective normative profile commitment, so both affective and normative commitment, that had the best impact on employees overall. So people who were high in affective and normative commitment, that had the highest impact or positive impact on employees. Like I said, I wouldn't get too into the weeds about this, but just an important individual difference to be aware of. In terms of social factors, when people treat people fairly, the more committed they are. I think we talked about this when we talked about motivation, how organizational justice impacts so many things. It's no surprise people respond positively when they are treated fairly. And this is what happens too. When people are treated fairly, they become more committed to their organizations. In terms of performance, in terms of impacting outcomes, so we now have talked about what leads to more commitment. Now let's talk about what commitment leads to. Commitment leads to a weak to moderate relationship with task performance. So while more commitment leads to better task performance, it's not a super strong relationship. And that's okay because some research has also shown that the impact of commitment is through other variables too. So it's a little bit more complicated than just commitment leads to more performance. We also find that, though, there is a strong negative impact on turnover. So the more committed you are, the less likely it is you are going to leave your organization. And that makes sense. If you feel bonded to your organization, you're far less likely to leave it. We find that this effect is especially strong on turnover intentions because remember, people can want to leave their organization without actually leaving it. And so we find once again that the more committed you are, the less likely it is you are to think about or plan on quitting your organization. We also find that there is a strong negative relationship between commitment and counterproductive behaviors. So the more committed you are, the less likely it is that you will engage in counterproductive behaviors in the workplace. So the more committed you are, the less likely it is that you will steal things, the less likely it is that you will waste time on the job.